Today's episode is brought to you by How's It Brewing. Located less than 1 mile from the surf in Honolulu, Hawaii, How's It Brewing was founded by true craft beer enthusiasts. Inspired by island flavors and palates, and melding that with the best of the Pacific Northwest and global styles and traditions, How's It Brewing specializes in high-quality, on-site brewed beers available for both wholesale and retail. So whether you're a bar owner, a serious beer lover, or just hop curious, they've got something for you. Stop by their tasting room and enjoy a wide range of carefully crafted beers, prepackaged options for the non-beer drinkers in your crew, and a rotating lineup of local food trucks that will keep your taste buds just as happy as your pint glass. The game's probably on one of their TVs, and you may even run into a local shaper to talk about that new board you've been wanting to order. I personally don't drink anymore, but when I'm on island, I always stop by to talk with Justin and his crew and enjoy a glass of their non-alcoholic slushie that I love so much. So make sure you stop by and check it out. That's How's It Brewing, 330 Kamani Street, Honolulu. Good vibes, great beer, and always something new on tap. Make sure you tell them Billy Jack sent you. Hello and welcome back to the Surfer's Library, proudly presented by Hillsborough Surf Club. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legends. Today I'm going to be reading The Last Wave by Greg Noll and Andrea Gabbard. This story is from the book The Big Drop, Classic Big Wave Surfing Stories, edited by John Long. Some 30 years later, people still talk about the swell of 1969, how it washed out roads and swallowed houses on the edge of the sea, how mountainous waves fired off various outer reefs, a spectacle old-timers had never seen in their lifetimes. And they still talk about Greg Noll, who on that winter day in '69 quite possibly rode the biggest wave any surfer ever paddled into, a Makaha beast estimated at 35 feet plus. Noll's ride has been captured in murals and song, written up 100 ways by 100 people, argued about endlessly, some insisting the wave was a legitimate 50-footers, others saying no more than 30. In any event, Noll's adventure at Makaha has become legend, arguably the most famous big wave ride of them all. In many ways, the winter of '69 was the peak of my life. I was 32. I had built a successful career of surfing and making surfboards. That winter, I returned to the islands and, as usual, stayed with Henry Priest in Haleiwa. I had stayed at Henry's house nearly every year since I'd first met him in Buffalo, Keaulana in the 50s, when I'd first started coming to the islands. Here I was, 15 years later, still coming to the islands each season for the big winter swell. Henry's little wood frame house is about 4 blocks from the water where you can hear the surf and feel it when it gets big. About 2 o'clock one morning, I woke up to the sound of a far-off rumble and the rattle of dishes in the kitchen. Half asleep, I thought, hell of a time to run the tanks through. Every once in a while, the Army would drive its tanks down from Wahiawa, through Haleiwa, and out to Cana Point. I got up to take a leak and suddenly realized there were no tanks. It was the rumble of huge surf breaking from the horizon. I started pacing, tried to sleep, paced again. By sunrise, my stomach was full of butterflies. My adrenaline was pumping. I was ready to go take a look at Waimea Bay. As soon as my wife Laura and I got there, I could see that the whole north shore was closed out. Solid white water as far as you could see. You can't go out when it gets that big. Laura and I decided to go take a look at Makaha, just for the hell of it. Every once in a while, when the north shore closes out, Makaha Point still has rideable surf. Far less often, when the north shore closes out, Makaha does this wonderful magical thing that I had heard about over the years from older surfers like George Downing and Buzzy Trent. If God sees fit to have that north swell come in an absolute perfect direction, Makaha gets unbelievably monstrous swells, as big or bigger than the ones that attack the north shore, except they're not peak breaks. These Makaha giants peel from the point in precise, seemingly endless walls. In the 15 years that I'd been coming to the islands to surf, I had never seen Makaha do its magic. Sure, I'd ridden a number of big Makaha Point days when the waves were breaking 20 feet, but compared to Waiamea's hang on to your balls super drop, Makaha Point surf just didn't have it for me. I had heard the stories. Supposedly, the really huge surf at Makaha only happens once every dozen or so years. I had missed the day in '58 when Buzzy Trent and George Downing rode some monster surf at Makaha. I was convinced that Waimea was where it's at, the ultimate go-for-broke spot. There's not a bigger place on the face of God's earth to ride than Waimea. That's the way it is and always will be, world without end. At least that's what I thought. Was I wrong? We headed to Makaha, taking the road that led around Kana Point toward the North Shore. We figured the worst that could happen is that it would become a good excuse to see my old pal Buffalo, do a little beer drinking, and talk stories Hawaiian style. I felt the intensity of 20 years of surfing bigger and bigger waves pent up inside me that day. As we approached Kana Point, we noticed several places where gigantic storm surf had already washed across the road. I told Laura to walk across the bad spots while I drove the car. I held my door open, ready to bail out if a wave hit the car. As soon as we reached Kana Point, I knew this day was going to be different. Terrifying waves of 50 feet or bigger were pounding the end of the island. We stopped at a couple of places to take pictures. One memorable photo from that day shows a giant wave dwarfing a couple of beach shacks in the foreground. Surfer Magazine printed it in its March 1970 issue with the description, Kana Point at 40, 50, 60, or 70 feet. That day, the waves demolished several shacks on Kana Point and nearby areas, as well as most of the road. As we got near to Makaha Point, I said, "Holy shit, it's happening." Makaha was doing its magic. Usually, no matter how big the north swell is, by the time it gets around to the Makaha side of the island, it dissipates, or you're looking at full-on stormy, windy, nasty weather. The horizon off Miley Beach, south of Makaha, becomes what the old-timers call a cloud break. The rate of speed of big swells creates wind and spray that rain down on the ocean. On this day, the water was nearly as smooth as glass, beautiful, and the waves were so big they literally put the fear of God in me. The radio began to broadcast evacuation orders for people in homes on Makaha Point. The police had started to put up barricades on the road, but we made it through. And there it was, not just rideable Makaha, great, big, horrifying Makaha. You couldn't even see the break from the normal place on the beach. You had to get back up on the hill above. On a normal, smaller day, the break comes off an inside reef. On a big 20-foot-plus day, the break comes around the point in a long wall and forms into a huge section referred to as the bowl. The unique thing about Makaha is that under perfect conditions, waves will hold their shape at 25 feet or, so the stories go, bigger. Today, that's what it looked like, bigger. Much bigger. The waves were breaking on a set of reefs I didn't even know existed, just inside where the blue water began. They looked like they were breaking out twice as far as usual. I started going into a mental freeze-up, and a haze settled over my brain like I was in a dream. There was just a handful of guys out in the water. Along the shore and on the hill above the beach, people were already lining up to watch. With the break so far out, it was almost impossible to see the surfers in any detail, let alone take clear pictures. I got my board waxed up and started looking things over, setting up a plan. I saw that the cross current was raging, so I knew that, to survive, I would have to swim like a son of a bitch for the point, or I would end up way down the beach past Klausmeyer's house. This house marks the place that is your last hope of getting ashore in one piece before the shoreline turns to solid rock. On a giant day like this, if you don't eat it in the surf, the rocks can easily get you. I waxed my board some more and headed into the water. It was surprisingly easy to get out. People have asked me, how in the hell did you even get out? Most of the breaks that would have been normal Makaha waves were just backed off soupy slop, and not that difficult to paddle through. It was like that almost to the point. Beyond the point is where the waves were actually breaking. I paddled way over to the left of the bowl, then headed straight out for a long ways past the break before I could paddle over to where a group of guys was sitting. They were all well-known big wave riders, including Fred Hemmings, Bobby Cloutier, Wally Froyseth, and Jimmy Blears. I had surfed different places with these guys for years. You could tell that this was no normal day. Usually we're out there laughing, joking, giving each other a hard time. When the surf gets really big, all that bullshit goes out the window. At Waimea, for instance, When the surf starts coming up, guys' attitudes would change. Peter Cole would get a little more hyper. Buzzy Trent would start talking faster. Pat Curran would get quiet. Peter likes to joke about how I'd start hyperventilating extra loud as the big monsters started our way. Today it was serious business. No laughing, no joking. Some of the guys were glassy-eyed and there was talk of calling in the helicopters. Since that morning, when many of the guys had first paddled out, the surf had been steadily building. Now it was at a size where all but the most experienced big wave riders call it quits. I sat there with the guys for about 45 minutes, watching these big, thunderous giants coming down out of the north from Yokohama Bay towards us. At times, they looked so perfect you'd swear you were looking at waves at Rincon or Malibu, only these waves were 30 feet plus high with a lip that threw out 90 feet or more. At other times, the waves broke in sections of 200 or 300 yards across. They were horrible, absolutely horrible. As they peeled off towards us, a giant section would dump and we'd count 1001, 1002, 1003, then boom. The wave would bottom out, and even though they were a quarter to a half mile away, the impact of the breaking waves was so tremendous that it made beads of water dance on the decks of our boards. I'd never seen that happen before. The whole situation gave me a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and the surf was still coming up. A few guys caught waves off the backside of smaller sets, hit the channel, and paddled in. Nobody even considered going for the big ones. The bottom line was obvious to every one of us out there. If you took off on one of the big waves and missed it, and there was a bigger wave behind it, you'd get caught in the impact zone where your chances of drowning were probably about 80% or better. If you paddled for one of these monstrous bastards and you didn't get to the bottom, but instead got caught high by catching an edge or hesitating for even a second, you'd tumble down the face of the wave and the whitewater would eat you alive. It would be like going off Niagara Falls without the barrel. It looked to me like my only chance was to paddle as though the devil himself was on my ass, then get to my feet and drive as hard as possible straight down the face of the wave. If I could at least get to the bottom before the lip folded over, then maybe I'd have a chance of drilling myself a hole at the bottom of the wave, and the mass of the wave would pass over me instead of pummeling me along until I simply ran out of air. I analyzed the situation a little longer and gave myself a better than 50% chance of surviving one of these monsters. I figured I had an edge, since all my adult surfing had been devoted to big waves. My motivation was competitive. Deep down, I'd always wanted to catch a bigger wave than anyone else had ever ridden. Finally, after a lifetime of working up to it, the time had come. The chances of this type of surf occurring again might be another dozen years away and out of my grasp. It was now or quite possibly never. I had put enough time into riding big waves to know there was no chance of actually riding one of those waves all the way through, not the way they were folding over in such huge sections. The best I could expect would be to get down the face to the bottom of the wave, make my turn, then put it in high gear and get as far as I could before the whole thing collapsed on me. Then I'd have to take my chances on the swim in. Getting in would be half the danger. If I survived the deafening impact zone, I'd have to fight my way through that strong current and into the beach before I reached the rocky shoreline. By this time, the crowd in the water had thinned way down. I paddled about 50 yards away from the other guys to try and think things through. That's my whole deal. I can wait. Like Peter Cole and Pat Curran, I've always been willing to wait for bigger sets. I always preferred to wait it out, catch fewer waves, but I hoped bigger ones. Shortly, everyone else had paddled in during the occasional lulls. It felt very lonely out there, but I was working on pure adrenaline. A lot of conflicts raced around in my head. My chance of a lifetime. Am I going to blow it or do something about it? I've got a family, kids, and people I care about a great deal. Is this goddamn wave really worth risking my life? I felt kind of crazy even considering it. What it came down to was that I realized I'd come all this way, all these years for this moment. This Makaha magic was only going to happen once in my lifetime, and that time was now. The next time it happened, I'd either be hobbling around on a cane or dead of old age. In either case, I'd forever miss my one chance to catch a wave this large. I've always had one kind of approach to surfing big waves. That is, don't hesitate. Once you decide to go, go. Don't screw around. You get into more trouble trying to change your mind midstream or mid-wave than you do if you just make a commitment and go for it. I spent about a half hour going through this mental battle before I made a decision. I want to do this. It's worth it to me. Above all, if I let this moment slip by, I knew I would never forgive myself. This probably was as close to the moment of truth that I would ever get. I paddled back to the lineup. I was oblivious to the fact that I was now the only guy left out there. All my thoughts were focused on catching the wave that might be my biggest and my last. Finally, a set came thundering down that I thought looked pretty goddamn good. Okay, I said to myself, let's give this thing a shot. Surfboards can do funny things at high speeds. If the board isn't shaped right, or the fin is set even slightly wrong, the board can track or catch an edge, sending you ass over tea kettle. I was very familiar with my board. I had made it for big waves and used it for 3 seasons. For me, it was the perfect big wave board. At 11 feet 4 inches long, with 1.5-inch scoop in the nose, it was a big gun for big waves. The first wave in the set looked huge. Something inside of me said, let it go. As I paddled over the top of it, I caught a glimpse of my wave. It was even bigger. I turned and began paddling hard. I felt a blast of adrenaline as the wave approached and lifted me and my board began to accelerate. Then I was on my feet, committed. You could have stacked 2 18-wheel semis on top of each other against the face of that wave and still had room left over to ride it. I started down the front of the wave and my board began to howl like a goddamn jet. I had never heard it make that noise. I was going down the face of that wave so fast that air was getting trapped somewhere. I flew down the face, past the lip of the wave, and when I got to the bottom, which is where I wanted to be, I looked ahead and saw the son of a bitch starting to break in a section that stretched 1.5 blocks in front of me. I started to lay back, thinking I could dig a hole and escape through the backside of the wave. The wave threw out a sheet of water over my head and engulfed me. Then for a split second, the whole scene froze forever in my mind. There I was, in that liquid green room that Simmons had talked about so long ago. I had been in and out of this room many times. Only here the room was so much bigger, more frightening, with the thunderous roar of the ocean bouncing off its walls. I realized I wasn't going to go flying out the other end into daylight. This time I feared there might not be a way out. My board came out from underneath me. I hit the water going so fast that it felt like hitting concrete. I skidded on my back and looked up just as tons of whitewater exploded over me. It pounded me under. It thrashed and rolled me beneath the surface until my lungs burned and there was so much pressure that I felt my eardrums were going to burst. Just as I thought I would pass out, the turbulence released me. I pulled to the surface, gulped for air, and quickly looked outside. There was another monster heading my way. There have been many times at Waimea when I've lost my board while trying to catch a wave and had to dive deep to avoid getting caught by the whitewater or soup of the next wave. As a big wave passes overhead, it causes tremendous pressure to build in your ears and you have to pop them to clear it. Here at Makaha, I waited for each wave to get within 50 to 75 yards outside of me. Then I dove down about 20 feet and waited for it to pass. When the first wave broke overhead, I popped my ears and waited a couple of seconds before I heard the muffled sound of rumbling whitewater. The underwater turbulence of the giant wall of whitewater overhead caught me and thrashed me around. These waves were so big and there was so much soup in them that each time I went under, the pain from the pressure in my ears was almost unbearable. In waves like these, if you can't equalize the pressure by popping your ears, you can lose an eardrum. I figured the best I could do was try to remain oriented towards the surface and let the turbulence carry me away from the main break. By the time I had cleared the impact zone, the waves had carried me inward about 300 yards. I started swimming for my life, hard for the point. The current was like a wild river, and my survival now depended on reaching the shore quickly. I reached for every ounce of strength I had left. I was still 100 yards or so off the beach. I could see Klaus Meyer's house at the end of the line. I could see the rocky beach coming up. I was a paddleboard champion, but never a great swimmer. But on that day, I had a real incentive to make it. I swam my ass off. Even the shore break was breaking big. I kept thinking, if I don't make it to the beach before I reach the rocks, I'll have no place to come in. Did I go through all of this hell just to get cleaned on the rocks? By now, I was swimming almost parallel to the beach. I could see my good friend Buffalo in his lifeguard jeep following me on the shore. The current was so powerful that the beach looked like it was smoking by me. I finally hit the shore 50 feet before the rocks began. I crawled up on the sand and flopped onto my stomach, amazed to be alive. Buff rolled up in the jeep, got out, stood over me, and shoved the beer in my face. "Good thing you make 'em, brother," he said, "'cause no way I was coming in after you. I was just gonna wave goodbye and say aloha." Buff was throwing a big party that evening. Normally I'd be up for a party, especially after a day of surfing, but that day I just said no. It was a long time before I ever spoke about that day at Makaha. I never knew how big the wave was, only that it was easily 10 foot bigger than anything I'd surfed at Waimea, and far more dangerous. From the very beginning, it had always been a joy for me to ride a bigger wave. At one time, a 6-foot wave was terrifying. Then I got comfortable at that stage, and an 8-foot wave was intimidating. Then a 10-foot wave challenged me, and so on. At one point, I was as comfortable riding a 20-foot as I had been riding 6-footers. And the thrill was always there. Big wave surfing is like an addiction. You always need more size to satisfy you. I think what finally happened to Makaha was that I realized how the addiction was bordering on insanity. At some point, a guy has to ask himself, are you going to keep this thing in perspective, or are you going to slip over the goddamn edge? After I had analyzed what I'd done, I asked myself, you're not going to top that, so where do you go from here? What do you do now? Well, thank you once again for joining us. I hope you liked that story. Until next time, keep your toes on the nose, your bottom turns tight, and your stoke high. I'll see you in the lineup.